Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I am a student of classical archaeology at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and on this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the delightful people working in the field. And we'll talk with archaeologists, historians, professionals, and more. Hopefully, we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today's episode is part of a very special series. I've traveled from my studio in Copenhagen all the way to Athens, Greece, and I'm here at the Danish Institute in Athens, or DIA as it's called, in a bit of a makeshift studio. So if you hear any scooters passing by or the aircon humming faintly in the background, that's why. During these special episodes, we'll be talking to some of the most interesting scholars and experts that Athens has to offer. And my guest today is Tue Søvsø. Welcome to the podcast, Tue.
Thank you.
And Tue, you're a philologist and a specialist in Roman philosophy. You got your degree from the University of Copenhagen back in Denmark, and you did your PhD in Berlin. And you've also been a fellow at the Danish Institute here in Athens, where we're recording this episode. And your work focuses primarily on Roman philosophical text and the way that classical texts have shaped intellectual traditions and more. And today we'll dive into some of the most notable Roman poets. But before we learn more about these poets, could you maybe first describe for us the context for their poetry? What world were they living in, and what sort of literary and cultural landscape were they writing in?
Yeah, sure. Of course, that's a big topic, but I think one of the first things to notice is, of course, that it's a very elite world. It's also a very male-dominated world, like all of Greek and Roman antiquity. We do have female Roman poets. We have Sulpicia, who is very much a part of these circles. So it's not an exclusively male world, but it is a place where, the standard figure would be a rich, sort of leisurely gentleman writing, either on the side of a public career or as a sort of emphatic rejection of pursuing a public political career. At the same time, the poets we are going to talk about, people like Catullus, Vergils, Ovid, and so on, were all living in a very turbulent world. It was the time just after the Great Expansion, the biggest expansion of the Roman Empire, and as we know now, but they didn't necessarily, the time just before the fall of the Republic, at least for Catullus. So it's a time of huge change. Also, I think socially, the society was changing, obviously going from being a little city-state among many to becoming a world empire has huge impacts on a city and the way of life that goes on in a city like Rome. And these figures, in a way, are some of our best sources for looking at what that meant.
All right. Thank you for setting the scene for us. And now let's dig deeper. So, one of the most famous Roman poets that you've mentioned also is Catullus. And Catullus was born in 84 BCE, and he died very young, around the age of 30 in 54 BCE. And he was writing in the last years of the Republic, and he was a bit of a rebel in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit about the bullet points of his life?
Well, I think the most notable thing for me about him was this, as we can at least suppose, emphatic choice not to pursue a public career. I mean, he died young, so maybe he would have later, but he does come from one of the most distinguished noble families of Rome. So he was very much part of the upper elite of Roman society, and very much a background that would have made you expect of him to go that way. And he refused, it seems. He chose to spend his life on writing poetry, and that in itself is a rather radical act, I guess. But as his poetry also speaks to, he seems to have been very explorative in many ways. So it sort of fits.
And what makes Catullus's poetry stand out in the broader landscape of Roman poetry?
I think what captures many readers today, at least, is its highly personal style. When you read it, it strikes you as extremely modern often. It's very common, at least in Danish schools, to teach Catullus because it's the kind of text that you can give young people and they can immediately relate to it. To some extent, that's an expression which it can be deceptive because there's also a lot of art in there. There's a huge divide probably between the poetic persona of Catullus and the actual sort of real flesh and bones human being writing it. And we don't know that much about his life apart from what we gather from his poetry. So that is a notable thing, I think, today, looking at it from our perspective, this very sort of modern in our eyes, very easily relatable persona that meets you in this poetry. But also in the eyes of the ancient, for instance, his contemporary Cicero, he was doing something new. Cicero coined the term the new ones to describe the group of poets that Catullus was part of. And that's another thing to emphasize. He was very much not alone in pursuing this kind of poetic project at this time. There was a greater literary environment taking off in these years, going back all the way to the middle of the second century BC. But he, for us, has this perhaps a bit too prominent position in this movement because he's by far the best preserved author of this movement. And what sort of very briefly characterizes that movement is that they were trying to do something different from sort of traditional Roman modes of literature. And Roman literature is, of course, at this point still very young in a way. It's not characterized by very set genres or a very long tradition, but on the other hand, it's oriented very much towards the Greek culture and literary traditions. And Catullus and his contemporaries seem to have oriented themselves very much towards the literary projects and sort of ideals of the Hellenistic authors like Callimachus and so on. And that's probably part of what made Cicero describe them as the new ones, the neoterics. But yeah, that's sort of perhaps the two perspectives of what makes him such an important figure, that he, on the one hand, writes in this way, which is very relatable, and on the other hand, in his own time, was seen as doing something new by following this tradition of Callimachus rather than, for instance, the traditions of one like Homer and Hesiod, the sort of epic tradition or the lyric tradition. Yes. Of the early Greek poets.
Yes, because one thing that was very famous about the neoterics, as you mentioned, is that they did this break from what had been before in the epic tradition of these very grand tales of heroes and gods and myths that are on a very large scale, and focus down on a bit more of an individual level. And Catullus's poems are, as you say, they're famously very personal, and they're also pretty emotional. Things like a stolen handkerchief or seeing his ex-lover with her actual husband sets him off into these very passionate rants, which was a bit unusual for the time. Bursts of emotions like this were not as common in Roman literature before this. But do you think he was consciously breaking with tradition, or was it just how he was?
I think he's more playing with tradition as I read him. What strikes me, I mean, he is in a way in good company. Even though it's very fragmentary, the stuff we have from Lucilius bears some strong resemblances here. So it's not that it's not radically new what he's doing, but he seems to be working with a lot of different traditions at the same time. And he's very sort of playful in the way that he combines these elements. So I think it's always tempting to think that you're seeing the person behind it. But I think he strikes me to be more of a sort of elusive character as author. That he presents you with these different personae, which go through what at the first sight appears to be a rant or like an emotional sort of explosion almost.
Yeah.
But then when you start looking at it, it's written in this extremely refined meters. It's very controlled and it's very sort of elegantly spelled out. So there's a tension there between the form and the content. Obviously, if you're raging mad, sort of, you probably won't speak in a
such a controlled way.
Yeah, in such a controlled way, and choosing your words with such extreme precision.
Yeah, because his poems, they're short, they're witty, and they're very sharp. So he does follow a sort of set framework in most of his poems. But what does this add to him as a poet? Like, does this make him more interesting, more significant than the others?
I wouldn't say so. I think he was extremely good at playing with different formats and very good at sort of creating an interesting tension between the medium he chooses and the things he wants to express with it. And that, I think that is what makes them a good read.
Compelling is the right word. Yeah.
In a way, it grabs you by the hair and keeps you. But yeah, it's difficult to pin down what his genius is in a sense.
But Catullus, he gives us these pretty personal, kind of an intimate voice from the late Republic. But next comes Virgil, who lived from 70 to 19 BCE. And he's often described as the poet of the whole empire. He's probably best known for the Aeneid. He gave Rome its great national epic, weaving together myth, politics, and poetry in the age of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Can you tell us a little bit about Virgil's role as a sort of national poet for Rome, if you can use that term?
Yeah, again, he's an extremely complex figure. One of the things that really influenced my reading, it's the fourth song, right, with Dido, with, of course, the death of Dido and this whole sort of grand emotional thing in the middle of it. Then you read all these other books, which are much more constrained in a way, and you get this sort of stern impression. And you have the whole biographical background, right, that he was sort of sponsored by Maecenas in some sense. He was read by Augustus and probably also in certain ways sort of encouraged to write some of his works. But at the same time, the moment you dive deeper into his stuff, it gets so much more complex. This is one of the eclogae where what you get on the outside is this, like, here he's playing with this Hellenistic genre of bucolic poetry, which has all these conventions in a way of painting a very idyllic setting and so on. But then the moment you start reading, the figures that turn up in these idyllic settings are people who have been displaced during the civil wars or who have been granted a piece of land by the warlords, the victorious warlords, right? So it's a very sort of fraught environment, actually. It's anything but idyllic. And it's a bit like Catullus. He has this extremely well-developed ability to play with form and content and create tensions. So one of the first books I read on Virgil called Further Voices in Virgils Aeneid. And he argues, I think, very compellingly against this full-blown narrative of national poem and Virgil as this purely propagandistic figure.
And his most famous work, the Aeneid, weaves Roman values and Augustus' political order into this new mythological epic describing the birth of Rome. And can you very briefly tell us what the Aeneid is about and how it shaped Roman self-identity?
Yeah, so the surface narrative of the Aeneid is very sort of clearly a founding myth of Rome. It starts with the fall of Troy, where Aeneas is by the gods asked to leave the city. And his mother, Venus, intervenes on his behalf and secures the promise from Jupiter that her son Aeneas will come to found a world empire. So already there you see like the ideology of the empire getting weaved into this narrative. The sort of opening scene is Aeneas fleeing. He's recounting his escape from Troy, and the second and third books tell this story about the fall of Troy and how he escaped the burning city, carrying his father on his back, sort of a paradigm example of filial piety, which was obviously one of the most important traditional values of Roman society, with his little son besides him, but leaving behind his wife, who has been caught in the fire and dies during the fall of Troy. And we get this very elaborate description of this. And all this is told by Aeneas at the court of Dido, where he ends up after a long journey together with his family and a small group of Trojan companions. And they're invited very cordially into the court of Dido.
In Carthage.
In Carthage, exactly. She's the queen of Carthage, this young, beautiful woman, falls immediately in love with Aeneas. And they have an affair, and it all gets complicated, and Aeneas is called back to the duty, his call, his sort of task here in life, namely to found this this empire. So he leaves Dido. She very dramatically kills herself on the top of a funeral pyre.
Oh, God.
This sort of
So that's two dead women.
Exactly. He leaves a blood trail of dimensions, this guy. But also portrayed as him doing his divine duty towards this mission of founding the Roman Empire. And the rest of the poem describes his arrival in Italy and the way he arrives in Latium, the Latin kingdom, and is taken in by the king there and marries his daughter.
Third wife.
Yeah, third wife, exactly. Or at least third woman in the narrative. And yeah, the battle with Turnus, his great opponent, which then sets the scene for Roman history onwards. And his son is called Iulus. He's the first member of the gens Julia, which is, of course, the family of Julius Caesar and the family which Augustus was adopted into. So even like in that way, the story of the poem sets the scene for this imperial propaganda, letting the current people in power, like at this time Augustus, who has stylized himself as the heir of Caesar and let himself be crowned as emperor. This narrative, of course, lets them trace their family history all the way back to Aeneas and
the founding of Rome.
Venus and the founding of Rome, exactly.
Do you think the Aeneid is straightforward propaganda, or is there more nuance to it than that?
No, so that's where it gets extremely interesting. During this whole narrative, Virgil shows a lot of interest and a lot of, I think at least, a sensibility for the human sacrifices that is involved in this. And Aeneas is in no way a straightforwardly sympathetic figure. He's not presented, I would say, in a way that makes him univocally one of the good guys. We already mentioned the blood trail he leaves. Yeah. It's not clear that he does well to Dido, and he found the later big sort of defining conflict for the Roman state is, of course, the many wars against Carthage. And Aeneas, in a way, sets off this conflict in this narrative, right, by leaving behind her.
The first domino.
Exactly. Yeah. So he very much sort of sets off some very negative effects. And in a sense, you can read it as him just doing his duty. He is like on a divine mission here, and he has to do that, and he does it against his will. And he's genuinely sad, sort of in the portrayal, to leave Dido behind. But on the other hand, his opponents all appear in a very sort of positive light, I would say. There's really nothing in the portrayal of Dido which makes you think, oh, she got what she deserved.
Yeah.
And in a way, it's the same with Turnus, like the big opponent in the end, whom Aeneas kills. And that's where there are so many problematic symbols in this text that get weaved around the figure of Aeneas, which suggests that under the surface narrative, which is, of course, very imperialistic, or what we want, maybe that's sort of anachronistic, but at least it's sort of, it speaks to this narrative of the Julian propaganda. But on the other hand, you have these symbols which are the symbolic of the text is deeply disconcerting when it comes to Aeneas. There are these narratives about snakes and fire already in the description of the fall of Troy. And these are the forces that destroy that city, the old Rome. And they're portrayed very negatively there. But when we have Achilles killing his opponent in the last book, we suddenly have the same we have the same language, the same sort of metaphors and pictures being invoked, but applied to Achilles. So in some way, we see the violence of this figure getting portrayed in a problematic light. And of course, the Roman founding myth is deeply disconcerting with the whole sort of fratricide of Romulus killing Remus. It's really a city in some ways born out of blood and crime. And the Romans were very aware of this and sort of very attentive to these tensions in their narrative. So I would say that Virgil is a lot less propagandistic. And of course, there's this biographical anecdote that he wanted the whole thing to get burned before he died. We don't have to believe that. But I think the basis of that anecdote, in a sense, is this sense that I think a lot of readers have had, that if this guy had wanted to write propaganda, the Aeneid would have looked a lot different. But there are all these little things which problematize the main narrative. That it's not that there isn't this strong propagandistic voice as well. And I think a lot of Romans also bought into this narrative of a state destined for power and dominance, world dominance. But I also think, this is a generation who had lived through 2 decades of civil war. They were very much aware of the cost. It's a society that has sent soldiers off non-stop almost to fight wars in distant countries. It's like thinking of the American military missions of the last 70 years, but just like doubling or tripling them. It was really something that almost every male member of Roman society had to do. And it's something that all the people who stayed behind were very aware of, because these people, of course, didn't return all of them. So this narrative of world dominance, of course, came with a price. And these people were very aware of that price. And differently from today, even though it's a niche elite thing to write this kind of poetry and to read it probably also, these people were still on the battlefield. Even though you were a general, you weren't sitting behind a desk ordering strikes.
You weren't safe from the violence yourself.
No, you were very much part of it, and you were expected to take part in the violence. I really like reading this also as a narrative about the cost of imperialistic or sort of power politics. And I think he has a very keen and sharp eye for these costs, and a very subtle but striking way of portraying it.
So there are definitely some hints of like an underlying critique of empire in the Aeneid, I guess you can say. And as you say, his personal beliefs have been much debated by scholars. But at the end of the day, the Aeneid did end up becoming this sort of national retelling of the birth of Rome. It ended up defining how the Romans thought of themselves, where they came from. So if Catullus gives us a poet's I and is very personal, Virgil seems to give us Rome's we and a sort of broad national focus. But is that too simple of a contrast?
I think it's a useful contrast. But of course, like all simple contrasts, it's simplistic as well. But yeah, I think it relates to another thing about their respective projects, that we really don't get a lot of knowledge about Virgil by reading his poetry. He's not very present. Catullus is very present. Whether it's Catullus or the persona Catullus is another thing, but he puts a persona just close to the poet in his poetry, and Virgil doesn't. And whether he was doing this in order to create more of a sort of public narrative in a way, is another thing. On the other hand, there's definitely something to it, and he was definitely read that way by a lot of school children probably as well.
So Virgil gives us Rome's great foundation myth, written in this kind of very serious and solemn tone. And one of Rome's next great poets is Ovid, who comes along about a generation later. And he lived from 43 BCE to 1718 CE and is probably most famous for his Metamorphoses. And what are the Metamorphoses about? Does Ovid use myth in a different way than Virgil, for example?
Yeah, so Ovid is, again, perhaps the most playful of the, at least one of the most playful poets in the Latin tradition. He really pushes the boundaries of a lot of both genres, but more than that, so what you can write about. And the Metamorphoses is this epic poem, so it's written in the same form as Virgil's Aeneid, but it consists of a lot of smaller stories stringed together, sometimes in not obviously related ways. But what they all have in common is that they involve this symbolic change. And so it's not only symbolic, in the narratives, it's very concrete. So it's physical change, exactly. But it always has this character of crystallizing out something in the character of the person who changes. And it's all these little narratives taken from Greek and Roman myth and mythology about figures who, by divine intervention, were changed into something else. So a very famous one is the story of Apollon and Daphne. the Greek god Apollo falls in love with this young girl, Daphne.
A nymph, right?
A nymph, exactly, who absolutely does not want to enter into any kind of relationship with him, and he chases her. So it's basically, what could have become a rape narrative, another rape narrative from the myth, but she runs away from this god, and of course that stands no chance, and then prays to her father for salvation, and he then transforms her into a laurel tree.
And her father was a river god.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that is then the explanation for why the laurel tree is holy to Apollo and associated with Apollo in antiquity. So it's this mixture of little stories that you read sort of just for fun, in a sense, on the surface. And then they have these also these etiological elements that they explain certain facts about either mythology or the world. So the names of plants or things.
Yeah, the Narcissus myth, for example, which is an explanation of why the flower is called a narcissus.
Exactly, yeah. So you have all these little stories. And of course, there are 1,000 attempts to try to sort of describe what this is all about. But I think what connects almost every interpretation of it is that it has this sort of almost mosaic impression that you get all these little narratives. I think what struck me reading it is just this technique of it. The way that across these different stories, it's a very subtle way of bringing forth different aspects of human life. So it thematizes a lot of very difficult and very sort of contemporary issues. This whole theme of transgression and male aggression, also about sort of the incontrollability of emotion. There are a lot of these narratives bring up these themes in different ways. And this form that Ovidius has chosen lets him tell these stories in a very monotonous rhythm of getting repeated narratives. It gets almost formulaic, this way that a narrative form is repeated. There's some kind of conflict of interest or attention, a fraught situation of some kind, a reaction to it, and that turns into a transformation.
And the theme of transformation is the most central one in the Metamorphoses. But do you know what transformation meant for him personally in his own life?
Well, I think what strikes me about his sort of biography is more this pure wealth of stuff that he wrote. So the Metamorphoses is his best known work, I think, now, but he wrote all these weird, or not weird, he wrote all kinds of texts. He branches out into a lot of different genres and explores a lot of different themes. And he was certainly a very controversial figure in Rome. He was sent into exile, possibly because of the Ars Amatoria, possibly because of personal intrigues at the court. It's very sort of debated why he was sent into exile, but fact is he was. And from there, he wrote these letters from exile, which are very sort of depressing in a way. There he's branching into the genre of Roman elegiac poetry. And at the same time, he writes the Heroides, the letters of heroines, where contemporary sort of research, it had this sort of bad reputation because it takes on the voice of women, which is obviously problematic as an elite male in this society. But on the other hand, it's a pretty remarkable move, I think, for a guy like him to decide to take the perspective of these women who were left behind. So he, for instance, writes one from the viewpoint of Dido to Aeneas. I'm not trying to paint him as a proto-feminist in any way, but he seems to have had this very clear taste for the victims of these narratives in a way.
Yeah, also in his Metamorphoses.
Exactly. That also relates to the Metamorphoses. It's clear that somehow a lot of his poetic attention goes to these minor figures in the grand narratives, and very often the people who are victimized by these dominant figures of the known narratives.
Yeah.
And I find that quite significant and interesting. Also because he's playful. He's not preaching. You don't get the impression that he's actually running a political agenda in any way in his poetry.
No.
It's just a genuine interest in what does the world look like from that perspective.
If Catullus was a bit of a rules breaker, Ovid is pretty much a full-blown wrecking ball. He turns everything upside down, and as you said, he was famously exiled by the Emperor Augustus. What happened between the emperor and the poet to make things so bad?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. It seems from these letters that he wrote from his exile that Ovidius wasn't quite sure either. He alludes to a mistake that he made. A lot of speculation has gone into that. He seems to have been a bit surprised by this reaction by Augustus. And I guess what might have been testing the patience of the emperor was this sympathy for the victims.
Victimized voices.
Yeah, but also this sometimes quite explicit narratives that he does, the Ars Amatoria, for instance. Of course, Augustus is famous for having introduced these policies of traditional family values almost.
Purity laws.
Yes, marriage laws and so on, against adultery and so forth.
And then he suffered the consequence for it, perhaps. All right.
Yeah, might be. It's quite plausible looking back at it.
So now we've looked at 3 great Roman poets, Catullus, Vergil, and Ovid. But what happens when we put them side by side? How do their works complement or challenge each other? And what does it say about cultural changes in Republican and then later imperial Rome?
That's a very good and very big question. But I think what always struck me very much about Roman poetry from this period, and also the broader literature from this period, is how human these figures appear to me, at least when I read them. I mean, they're all problematic in their own way, but humans are problematic, right? And I think what is striking is that they're all struggling to give voice to a deep concern about how things are. It's not that they're subversive in any way. That would be crazy to say that, at least of Virgil, but I think it would be an exaggeration also for both Catullus and Ovidius. But they have this great sense of the tensions and conflicts in this society. And I think it's often sort of missed in discussions of these texts because they're also so artistic. They're so much on top of their poetic game that you easily just notice the elegance and the perfection of their style and how they're also very much interested in this side of literature, how form shapes your project as a poet and what ideals you're orienting yourselves towards. And they write whole poems about their poetics, so to say. So
meta poetry.
Yeah, really. At the same time, all in their own very distinctive way, seem to be struggling to give expression to a deep disconcern about the society they live in. They're insisting on putting into their texts these scenes that show you some of the cracks that are showing up in Roman society at this point. It's in Catullus, in the way he puts himself in his poetry, I think. There it's not very outspoken, I would say. But in Virgil, I think you get it really in these counter narratives almost, these further voices that he writes into the Aeneid and the eclogues as well. With Ovidius, you get it more explicitly. That's why he has this reputation as well.
Yeah.
But I think they're all actually sort of grappling and searching for formats where you can express some of these more existential doubts about the Roman way of life. And that is, I think, a very fascinating thing about Roman poetry of this period. And a lot of the themes of Roman elegiac poetry, this whole idea that you can be a soldier of love and so on, are in a way brushed off as mere sort of, ways of speaking or poetic metaphors. But when you think about it, in a society where your main duty as a man is to do military service for Rome, it's quite radical to stand up and refuse to do that in order to serve your beloved. Even though you might not be a very kind and caring man towards that beloved, and she might just be your sort of material for living out your fantasies, but still standing out in the public, refusing to do your duty as a Roman citizen.
But if you had to introduce one of them to a modern student or a reader first, which one of them would you recommend that they pick and why?
I think a very good place to start is Dido's, the fourth song of the Aeneid. It's really a masterpiece, and you can read it as a standalone little piece. It's very gripping, a lot of emotions there, a lot of very nice poetic descriptions of this whole relationship, and it really to me at least, captures many of these tensions in Roman poetry from this period because it's part of this grand narrative. Also, it very clearly brings out the costs of doing your duty, the human cost, the trail of blood you leave behind if you go and do that duty. It's full of very gripping scenes, and it's one of my personal favorites, at least.
Well, that was actually my next question. Who's your own favorite Roman poet? I mean, we've talked about 3 of the big ones. Is it any of them, or is it someone completely different?
I don't know. It's difficult. I think if I had to just come down on one, it would probably be Propertius.
Okay, great. So, Tue, I think that brings us to around the end of this episode. But before I let you go, I would love it if you could just do maybe either a quick summary of what we talked about, or if there's one key takeaway that you'd like our listeners to take with them after listening to what we've talked about. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This was a very nice trip down memory lane. But I think one thing that I would sort of encourage the listener to do if they gotten an interest in some of this is to really just sit down with 1 or 2 texts and try to think about this human dimension and these tensions that we've talked a bit about. Sometimes it's difficult to find an access to some of these texts because they can be very stylized and sort of foreign to us. But I think that's a nice way into it, and it makes it very relatable. And some of these authors are very forthcoming in that respect. So I can warmly recommend doing that. Trying to imagine the people behind them and remember they're problematic figures in their own ways, all of them, but they're also very interesting and very human. At least that's what I like very much about reading this stuff. That's
really great. That's a good answer. Thank you very much, Tue. Ever since I learned of them, the Roman poets have fascinated me so much, so I'm glad we got the chance to talk about some of them today. Tue, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots and that you're now ready to go pick up your own copy of the Aeneid. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. And you can also reach us on Instagram over at Let's Dig Deeper Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. My name is Zinat Haroun, and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!